thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you again to the organizers for this really interesting and very rich conference. Well, I'm Milene. I'm Milene Mendes de Oliveira, a postdoctoral researcher in the ReDICo project, and which is based at the University of Potsdam. And I'm currently visiting research fellow at King's College London. And I'm here today to report on some of my findings on intercultural communication between university students via the video conferencing software Zoom. And the title of the presentation is Navigating Digital Interculturality on Zoom, Interactional Practices and the Search for Intercultural Competence. I hope you enjoy it. Well, as you know, Zoom and other video conferencing tools enable people from so many different walks of life to come together and to do things together. An important skill very much cherished in these contexts is intercultural competence. Ideally, we want to be able to create an atmosphere that will make everyone feel valued, that will trigger everyone to participate, and that will profit from diversity. This is what we want. This is the mindset we have. Yet, how is this put into practice? Today, I'll show you some of the practices used by students to display an intercultural orientation. More specifically, I'll show you how students unconsciously build on the notion of unfamiliarity. I'll show how this orientation is shared and put into practice by several students in different groups. And finally, you'll also see what happens when there is a feeling that this orientation is missing in the group. First things first, this study is based on an understanding of culturality as familiar multiplicity and interculturality as unfamiliar multiplicity. According to the theory of interculturality by Bolton, interculturality can turn into culturality through the progressive creation of routines and common ground. The intercultural communication literature has emphasized the connection between interculturality and dialogue. Thus, if we want to get at intercultural understanding, we need to exercise dialogue in open and non-hierarchical ways. This will lead to the fusion of horizons of meaning in Gadamer's sense. These definitions lead to the notion of intercultural competence, which has been defined as, for example, the capacity to communicate efficiently and appropriately with people of dissimilar cultures, or the ability to function effectively across cultures, to think and act appropriately, and so on. These definitions comprise two aspects I'd like to call your attention to. First, there is this message of appropriate communication, which is rather vague. And second, it seems that culture here is pretty much national or regional cultures. For example, take a look at home or abroad at the end of this second quote. There is another notion of intercultural competence, which is this one, the ability to transform interculture characterized by uncertainty into culture. And this notion relates quite well to Bolton's theory of interculturality. That's why it's important to ask, how can one transform interculture into culture? And I want to argue that this is done in interaction. That's my research question is, what are interactional practices used as attempts to build culturality out of interculturality in decision-making sequences in an online intercultural setting? Before I show you some of those interactional practices, let me walk you through the methodology. Quick and dirty. I gathered university students from different countries and linguistic backgrounds around a so-called intercultural game played on Zoom and originally developed by Bolton for the development of intercultural competence. I now have a wonderful database of videos comprising more than 50 hours of intercultural interaction in English as a lingua franca and written reflections by most of the 74 participants. Those participants were divided into 9 groups who follow the same trajectory in the game. I mean, they do the same tasks, but they end up getting to very different outcomes, not only in practical results of the game, but especially in terms of the relationships they develop in this highly intercultural scenario. Even though these results are different, as you'll see, several of these students display an orientation towards building bridges with students who are not from their own universities. The data I'll be showing today feature students engaged in the first task of the game. And in this task, they were given some characteristics of a fictitious city. So, for example, the population, the economic sectors, educational institutions, and these kinds of things. And they were supposed to find a name for the city. Because I want to look into practice, I need to look at the nitty-gritty details of interaction. And to do this, I need conversation analysis. Roughly speaking, conversation analysis dissects the infrastructure of turn-taking, meaning how people take turns, what actions they accomplish with each turn, and how they make sense of each other's contributions and intentions and try to coordinate them with their own. But this is so mundane that you might be tempted to ask, who cares? Well, but if you give some thought to this, you probably realize that turn-taking is the very basic tool that we have to develop our humanity, our exchanges with other human beings, and dialogue, including, of course, intercultural dialogue. And this links back to the idea of cosmopolitanism as practice, put forth by my colleagues Roman and Fergal, and also cited here in this conference. Well, whether turn-taking in a certain interaction is conducive to intercultural understanding is, however, an empirical question. And the database of videos I have of university students in the context of the intercultural game allows me to check how participants are managing these interactions in real time, or how they are managing these aspects in authentic interactions. To narrow down the analysis, I decided to focus on decision-making processes as a high-stakes activity in human interaction. In the following slides, you'll see transcripts I used in the analysis. You'll see two colors, green and blue. The green and the blue colors are used to distinguish between students from different institutions. So what you need to know is that the greens are acquainted with each other by the time the game begins. And the same is true for the blues. But the greens and the blues are not acquainted with one another. And in this sense, sometimes in the analysis, I'll be referring to the other group as an out group. Well, let's start with the findings, and I'll show you some prototypical cases. So first of all, I'll show you examples of two players who display, not two players. I'll show you two examples of groups that display an orientation to the outgroup. So first of all, here we have a proposal, yeah? So there is an excerpt of interaction, and then in line 4, you have a proposal by Lena, who says, we could just say Wine Hill or something. Remember, they're discussing the name for the city, yeah? And after the proposal, she uses a post-proposal display of uncertainty. She says, I mean, that's not super creative, but which is very recurring across all the groups playing the game. And I suspect this has to do with an attempt to avoid creating hierarchies in the game. Okay, so after the proposal, we have two people agreeing in lines 6 and 7, and they are from the out group, so from the other group. So here you can see how this intergroup negotiation becomes important. Another case. Here we have Helmi, in line 4, for example, who repeatedly responds to proposals made by participants from the other group. So first, they suggest New Veritas, and she says, yeah, that sounds cool. Then there is another proposal, New Vinotas, and she says, yeah, that's nice. And then later on, she she displays another agreement with an upgrading quality and says, I think that's a great name. Those are examples of cases that were found recurrently in the data. Now, let's look at what happens when this outgroup orientation, which is proper of intercultural competence, is felt or is acknowledged as being missing in the data. So here we have a longer excerpt, and I'll walk you through this excerpt. Here we have Lina, and she starts the facilitation. So she introduces the task. Okay, so we need to find a name. Do we have an idea, or is there anything that we can all agree on? We can already notice an overall orientation to being open and inclusive, which fits well with an idea of intercultural competence that fosters dialogue. Yeah, we can all. Then Natalie comes in with a proposal in lines 8 to 11. And then she says, I was thinking of like maybe using the first letters of all of our first names, and I came up with the name, she types, Nelsh, but I don't know if that's okay. And she laughs a little bit. So I don't know if that's okay is another post-proposal display of uncertainty. Note that this is all happening among in-groups, only the Greens, yeah? And what Natalie's colleagues do is, so they laugh, but it's not disrespectfully, and they repeat the name here. Zabina repeats the name, she laughs, and then Nelsh. And, but they seem a bit reluctant to show agreement at this point. But in line 16, Lina does show agreement. She says, oh, I think it's a good idea. However, Natalie seems to want extra support for this, very likely from the outgroup, because she keeps on accounting for her proposal. For example, in lines 18 and 19, again, another post-proposal display of uncertainty. She says, I don't know what, that was just the first one that came to mind. In line 21, there is one reaction from the outgroup. So the participant says, I think it's cute, and laughs a little bit. However, there is another participant from the blue group who has not responded yet. So neither Natalie, the person who did the proposal, nor Lina orient to this decision as finished. Instead, in lines 22 to 24, Natalie accounts again for the proposal and opens room for alternative proposals. So she says, I had all of our first name letters, and then later she says, we can just take anything else. That was just my first idea. Okay, and then Lina agrees again. She says, well, in line 27, well, actually, I think it's very good, so, but she suddenly proposes a rather unexpected way to move forward with the decision, to vote. And she says, maybe we can vote. We can use the Zoom signs, which displays an orientation to inclusion and to being democratic. In line 29, so this is her agenda proposal, and then in line 29, Natalie agrees. So she says, oh yeah. And in line 30, Lina moves on to explain, oh, maybe raise your hand if you're okay with it. So starting the voting procedure. However, the colleagues seem a bit confused. So what are they voting actually? Because there aren't two possibilities to vote. So the vote would be, do you agree or disagree? But this is actually not very helpful to move forward with the decision to find a name for the city. And then in line 34, Natalie says, she starts moving forward with trying to come up with another name. And Natalie says, we just use a Latin translation for what the city has to stand for, according to the descriptions they had. And then Sabina asks, what's the Latin word for horse? Because horseback riding was an important activity in that city. And then she says, oh, so maybe we can use that one. But all of a sudden, another person from the green group, so they were moving forward with that decision. They were looking for the Latin name of horse in order to come up with another alternative name. But then Sabine stops for a while and says, unless someone disagrees, pointing again to the importance of showing openness in this context. And the decision is only treated as finished when the other person from the blue group expresses her verbal agreement as well, and she says, I think that Nelsh is cute. Only after that, the facilitator Lina, so here we have the agreement, so only after that, the facilitator Lina restates her agreement and the decision is treated as finished by the group. So it's a very long process. And this whole detour is caused by the fact that one contribution by the intercultural other, by the person from the blue group, was oriented to as being missing. In this group, the interaction was hampered actually several times. And out of the 9 groups in the game, this was one in which the lowest levels of engagement were reported. In fact, Natalie, the person who made the proposal, even abandoned the game in the middle. Not this session, but after 2 other sessions. All right. So here we have all participants and the green ones. So the green ones are shown and the blue ones are shown. Yeah, so as you'll see. Oops.
Okay, so we need to find a name. Do you have an idea? Are there many, or is there anything that we can all
I had an idea.
There's similarities maybe?
So I was thinking of like maybe using the first letter of all of our first names, and then I came with the name Nelsh. I know that's okay. It sounds kind of weird.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Or maybe we could just arrange the letters. I don't know. That was the first one that came to mind.
I think it's cute.
It has all our first name letters, or we just can take anything else. That was just my first idea.
Well, actually, I think it's very good. So maybe we can vote. We can use little signs. Maybe raise your hand if you're okay with
Nelsh. Or maybe Nelsh Bay. I mean, or we just use a Latin translation for what our city has to stand for. Like if we say our city has to be known for agriculture and tourism, and we just translate it to another language and see if that's fitting.
What's the Latin word for horse? Because they are into horse riding, right?
Oh yeah, right.
So maybe we can use that one.
Yeah.
Let me check it.
Yeah.
Unless somebody disagrees.
I think the Nelsh is cute.
Yeah. I would stick with the Nelsh as well.
Okay.
Maybe the first guess is sometimes the best. Okay.
All right. And then, so let's go back to the research question. What are interactional practices used as attempts to build culturality out of interculturality in decision-making sequences in an online intercultural setting? The answers that my analysis provided me with are proposals very often, but not always followed by post-proposal displays of uncertainty. And the proposal is followed by agreement by outgroup members. The relevance of outgroup members is what is novel here. And this points to an orientation to unfamiliarity as the norm. But here, though, I want to remind you that we are talking about students participating in an intercultural game. So the results might differ quite a lot for participants who are not primed into interculturality, into the topic of interculturality. Another point is that lack of reciprocity can be perceived as threatening and in need of restoration. And finally, these examples show that intercultural competence is a property of groups and not only individuals. And which is in agreement with previous studies, and moreover, the analytical focus placed on unacquainted groups rather than on national cultures proved to make sense. Additionally, it was shown that intercultural competence is achieved interactionally through practices that are co-constructed turn by turn in interaction. Zooming out, I'd like to mention that if we want to understand big phenomena such as interculturality, inclusion, discrimination, and the like, the study of everyday interaction is very important because this is the bread and butter of social life. This is where micro practices happen, which might have an enduring impact on individuals and societies. Thank you very much.